I want to go back to the Sirach reading. You might even pull that back out. While you're getting that, just a note about the book of Sirach, which has lots of different names. Part of the wisdom literature, which we find other wisdom literature in places like Song of Solomon, and places like Proverbs, and places like this. And some of the Psalms are actually wisdom literature. And we find them in a book that we Episcopalians, and not a book, but we find them in a section that we Episcopalians and Lutherans call the Apocrypha. These are writings that were done probably between 200 BCE, before the Common Era, and 400 CE, the Common Era, in other words, after Christ. They were not included in the Hebrew Bible because they were concerned in the Hebrew scriptures that some of those that were after Jesus were too much influenced by those who were followers of the Jesus movement, the Jesus way. However, when the church began to be institutionalized under Rome in the west, and Constantinople and Alexandria and all the other places in the east, because it really wasn't just one place in the east. So the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox claimed all of these as part of Scripture, canonically as part of the Old Testament. Then when the Reformation came along, in bucking the Roman Catholic Church especially, the Reformers decided that they would not use that they would go to what was Hebrew canon, which cut those out. And as usual, the Anglican Church and the Roman Church decided to come down the middle. So, though we don't count them in the same way we count the canon of Old Testament Scripture, which is basically the Hebrew Scriptures, and the New Testament canon, which is basically the Scriptures written after the time of Jesus, about the early movement of the church. We do count them as things worthy of being read in church and read for our ethical and moral ways of life, our ability to live as God asked us to live in love and grace and acceptance and forgiveness. And more you see these also being read in other churches, because the lectionary, the Revised Common Lectionary, which this is assigned for this Sunday, is the same one used in the Methodist Church today, the United Methodist, the Presbyterian Church USA, and many other churches that have started using the Scriptures. So that's where I want to start, with the wisdom of Sirach. And I want to start with this line. If you choose, you can keep the commandments, and to act faithfully is a matter of your own choice. And having started there, let me say first that what we need to remember whenever we hear the word commandments are the two commandments that were always considered from Hebrew Scriptures on the foundation of everything. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Anybody know what those two are? The first is love God, love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And then sometimes they will also, in certain places it'll say strength, and sometimes it doesn't, okay? Love God. And what's the second one? The second one is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So if you know that, if you choose, you can choose to love God with all your heart and soul and mind and all your strength. And you can choose to love your neighbor as yourself. And to act faithfully to those two commandments is a matter of your own choice. We choose whether we will direct our love in the ways that God loves or not. We have that choice, regardless of what happens on the outside. Regardless of the chaos, in every situation, we have the option to choose. I was thrilled last week at our diocesan convention that in the affinity groups, the groups that people could break up and go into for further discussion, they were all in one way or another focused on both this idea of making choices about how we show our love for God and making choices about how we show our love for each other. And several of them mirrored something that I had said 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago in my sermon, I talked about the 5 interlocking injustices that the the name just left me, the People's Campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, thank you. I knew I'd forget it if I didn't write it down. The Poor People's Campaign that not only started back in 1968, but continues today. And I had brought up the 5 interlocking injustices that the Reverend William Barber had talked about in an interview. Let's see if anybody remembers them with me. One, systemic racism. Another, systemic poverty. Okay, systemic poverty, systemic racism, ecological devastation, an economy that primarily is based on war and militarism. In other words, our judgments are made by how militarily strong we can be. That's where we allocate our money. That's what they're talking about there. And the last one was a religious culture, a religious nationalism that says we don't talk about those things. We don't talk about the above. Okay? So that the premise there was that those interlocked together. And one of the things that made me so happy at the convention was that we talked about some of those things. Especially talking about racial issues, especially talking about the social action issues and civil discourse, and especially talking about ecological devastation. And we're an example in that. We didn't really go so far as to talk about the war and militaristic economy, but the fact that we hit 4 out of those I thought was huge. So what I would like to do is, we had several representatives from there. I was there and Ron was there as clergy delegates. Our lay delegates were John Mott and Tina Sparks and Rick Roach, who is back there looking at me. I should remember that. And then we had guests, Barbara Mott and my husband, Jim Browne. Between all of us, we covered 3 of them. A lot of us went to the one on racial reconciliation, but Jim went to the one that dealt with ecological, with creation care and ecological issues, and Tina went to the one on civil discourse, right?
No. I went to the challenges and joys of small churches.
Okay, all right. Challenges and joys of small churches. All right. So what I'd like to do is to have first we're going to start, since more of us went to the racial one. We're going to start with you, Tim, if you'll come up here, please. And I'm going to ask each one of the people that attended one of these to answer 2 questions. The first question I'm going to ask you is, what did you hear that was important to you in the session you went to? And then the second question is, what is your hope of what might happen going forward in the church during this next year before we go back and meet again? So Tina, would you tell us a little bit about, the name of yours and...
The challenges and joys of small churches. One thing I've learned that there's degrees of small churches. We are a small church, but there are smaller churches than we. And another thing I learned, that it's okay to be small. It's how you view your smallness. You can be small in number and be very large in commitment and in activism and in the way you meet your challenge of that smallness. I think that was.
And what's your hope?
My hope is that small churches are not forgotten, and that we're not made to feel small by larger churches.
All right. Thank you, Tina. Thank you. Let's give Tina a hand. Jim Brown, will you come up?
All right.
And if you'll start by giving the name of the group you've attended.
I wish I remembered it. I don't know exactly what they called it, but it was creation care is my favorite term for that general thing. Sustainable living. What was it called?
That's close enough.
Okay, whatever.
So your first question is, what is one thing you heard that was important to you in that group?
Okay. The group in general that I heard that I identified with a lot was the frustration of where we are in that whole process of learning to live more sustainably in the world, of using, and also encouraged to use a term like creation care rather than global warming or climate change or anything like that is more politicized these days. And if we stay away from politicized words, then we can have a conversation and have meaningful dialogue about how to proceed.
Okay, thank you. Now, what's your hope?
My hope, my hope. The greatest hope I got from attending that group was that there is a lot going on in various churches, and sharing what they were doing was very meaningful. There is a hope that someone has collected names and to start groups in locales, like one for this area, one for Upper East, one for Chattanooga area, where people can get together and share their experiences and learn from each other. And also, the corollary of that for me is the hope that the youth movement that is worldwide will continue to grow and be a leader in helping us get there.
Thank you. Give Jim a hand, please. Now, everybody, all of you who went to the racial reconciliation group, if you'll come forward, and I'll give you each a chance on your own to do that. Briefly, yeah. So what I'm asking all of you to come forward, please. What I'm asking, I'll ask each of you is first just in a word, a phrase, or one sentence to say what you heard that was important to you. And then I'll ask you what your hope is going forward. So come on up and be here. John, I'm going to let you go first, okay? You'd rather be last. All right, John, I'm going to let you be last. And if you'll go over there, Rick, would you be first? All right. So, Rick, what was one thing that you heard that was important to you in that group?
That we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And what is your hope going forward?
That we have the strength to do the work.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Who's going next? Okay, Barbara Mott. Okay. One thing that you heard that was important to you.
I heard other churches express, for some of them maybe it felt like the first time they actually considered what their history was, and with what their racial history was, what their relationship was with the racial community and part of their own church, and also the fact that Episcopalians, for the most part, historically were plantation owners and were slave holders, and that there is a great deal of work still to be done, which you can see by how white the convention was.
Right. Okay, and your hope?
My hope is we actually collected emails, and that we actually want to get together. Some of the people who spoke, it was very important that they were speaking up, and I hold those emails so we get together, and there's hope. The hope is that we have hope.
Ron?
How come you get to go last?
Because he asked first. Ask and it shall be given. If you ask first. Go ahead.
You ask first.
The first question.
Is something you heard that was important to you?
What I heard was a stronger willingness to discuss these issues. I was at the convention last year, and I think the response to these issues was stronger and more positive, although people don't really know how to talk between cultures very well, so we have to fix that.
And your hope?
My hope is that we're able to really explore the roots of our cultural relationships between Native Americans and African Americans and Western Europeans.
All right, thank you. And John, the truth is I really get to go last, but you can go second to last.
Not going close to last
I'll vote for you.
is you can just say my voice also.
Okay, is that what you said?
But I think it's
What you heard that was
most emotional time
Ah,
I experienced.
And your hope.
Easy to get upset, and we can somehow talk through.
That we can talk through the emotion.
Emotional baggage.
All right, thank you. Let's give him a hand too.
Can I say one thing? It's a very small church, you know how small this church is. We had 7 people at convention.
Right, thank you. So what I heard not only in that group, but in people talking about it, is just the beginnings of some conversations that maybe have the opportunity to be more honest than the kind of conversations we usually have, which are usually just either up against each other, like the 2 talking head models that we get on TV, or we're trying to be so nice and so politically correct that we never say anything at all. And so my hope is that we will continue to find ways, and that maybe even in this small church, we may be able to find ways to sponsor opportunities for people to come together with that kind of honesty. And that when we do, we'll be able to make it a safe place where people can really say, speak their emotions as well as their thoughts. Where maybe at the beginning we might be more interested in hearing each other than in solving a, quote, problem. We have to get to a point of solving a problem, but unless we take the time to really hear each other, those solutions are going to be very thin. So at the same time that we continue to work for justice, and we must for people to have better lives, and advocate and do all the things that we try to get out there and do. At the same time we do that, we also need to be able to have conversations where people can simply be honest about their thoughts, their feelings, their fears. It's not an either or. And we're so used to it either being this or that. We are trained in our culture. The wisdom of our culture begins very little with the way we are given blocks or colors to sort. And this pile gets to be all the red colors, and this pile gets to be all the blue colors. And this hole gets all the round things, and this hole gets all the things. We're taught that. And it's a good thing to know in terms of some things. But when we generalize it to every aspect of our life, that wisdom falls apart. The wisdom that Sirach speaks of, that we can choose, is stronger than that wisdom. It is a wisdom of wholeness, a wisdom of whole cloth, a wisdom where the cloth depends on many different threads that are woven together, and if you leave one of them out, you don't have the whole cloth. And so we need all of this. We need to fight for justice, but we also need to have times when people can simply come and, from different points of view, and talk about where they are. And we have, as Sirach said, we have the choice. May we make wise choices. Amen.
Amen.